Welcome to my presentation on my project focused on translating cardiac data to a musical medium. I've been working on this project in collaboration with a professor from Furman University for almost a year now. Beginning with a brief overview of heart rate variability, heart rate is measured in BPM, or the number of beats per minute, which is a fundamental measure of how hard your heart is working to circulate blood. A normal resting heart rate, which can be measured when an individual is asleep, typically falls between 40 and 80 BPM. In most cases, a lower BPM closer to between 40 and 60 is a sign of good cardiovascular fitness. On the other hand, a consistently high heart rate, over 80 BPM, might signal stress, anxiety, or potential cardiovascular issues. Several factors influence heart rate, such as physical activity, stress levels, medications, and overall fitness, with regular exercise usually resulting in a lower resting heart rate. Heart rate variability, or HRV, captures the variability in time between each heartbeat, measured in milliseconds. This variability reflects the balance between the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight driver, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which promotes rest and recovery. High HRV is a sign of a healthy, adaptable heart and a well-functioning autonomic nervous system, suggesting you're resilient to stress and in good cardiovascular shape. Conversely, low HRV can point to stress, fatigue, overtraining, or a heightened risk of cardiovascular disease, indicating that the body might be struggling to adapt to changes or stressors. The root mean square of the successive differences, or RMSSD for short, is a specific measure of HRV which focuses on short-term variability. It calculates the square root of the mean square differences between successive heartbeats, offering a glimpse into parasympathetic nervous system activity, or vagal tone. RMSSD is favored in clinical and research settings because it's less influenced by breathing patterns than other HRV metrics. A higher RMSSD value suggests robust parasympathetic activity, correlating with better stress management and overall health. On the flip side, consistently low RMSSD values may signal chronic stress, poor recovery, or potential heart-related issues, while higher RMSSD values indicate strong cardiovascular health and resilience to stress. Without further ado, let's move on to the code. This script was created in Octave programming language, which is an open source alternative to MATLAB. We begin by defining two distinct sets of physiological data, one for sleeping state and the other for a waking state, both of which are 10 notes long in this example. Each set includes a list of average hourly BPM and an RMSSD value. The first step in the process is to calculate the average BPM for both sleeping and waking periods. These averages give us a sense of the general pace of the heart during these two states. But we're not just looking at the averages individually. We combine them to get an overall BPM, which then helps us to determine the time signature. If this combined BPM is greater than 60, we opt for a 4/4 time signature, which is the most common in modern music. If it's lower than 60, we switch to a 3/4 time signature, often associated with waltzes. Next, we decide on a musical key. This decision is based on the average BPM during sleep. If the average sleeping BPM is particularly low or high, below 30 or above 60, the key is set to D minor, otherwise it is set to C major. Now we turn our attention to the relationship between the RMSSD values of the two states. The ratio of sleeping RMSSD to waking RMSSD tells us about the relative stress or relaxation between the two periods. Depending on this ratio, we can decide on the type of arpeggio accompaniment to use during waking and sleeping hours. A high ratio, above 1.5, outputs a rapid 30-second arpeggio accompaniment for waking hours, with the sleeping hours using a slightly more relaxed 16th arpeggio rhythm. If the ratio falls between 1 and 1.5, waking hours get a 16th arpeggio, while the sleeping hours are paired with a triplet eighth arpeggio. A lower ratio below 1 indicates that sleeping hours have a lower RMSSD and thus are more stressful. Thus, sleeping hours have a bass-heavy eighth note accompaniment, whereas waking hours receive a less dramatic triplet arpeggio. As you can see, the accompaniments gradually get slower. This is because a high relative RMSSD ratio is indicative of an effective switch between sympathetic dominance when active and parasympathetic dominance when at rest, and thus good youthful cardiac health. If the ratio is closer to or below 1, it might indicate a lack of autonomic flexibility, which is a common symptom of aging. We then dive into the heart of the code, translating BPM values into musical notes. Depending on whether we've determined the key to be minor or major, each BPM value is mapped to a specific note. This transformation is like converting the heartbeat to a melody, where every beat finds its counterpart on the musical scale. Once translated, we display these notes, giving us a melodic representation of our BPM data. Finally, the code evaluates which chord sequences should accompany these notes in the form of a polyrhythm in the right hand, which is tailored to the RMSSD values. For waking hours, the code generates sequences in the determined key and modifies them based on the arpeggio accompaniment. Sometimes the chord sequence is marked with a ×4 or a ×2, depending on which accompaniment rhythms the melody must accommodate. The same process is repeated for sleeping hours, ensuring that each state has its distinct musical signature that reflects the associated cardiac activity. For this first example, we have a relatively unhealthy individual with signs of aging such as a high resting BPM and a lower RMSSD value when resting and a higher one when active. When we run this in our command window, we get our time signature, our key, our accompaniment, our melody, and our chord progressions. We can then transcribe this directly into any music notation application. This is one from the example just described. And for this example, we have a healthier individual with signs of youth, such as a lower resting and higher active BPM, and a higher RMSSD of sleep than when awake.